if we could live without failing people, Jesus wouldn't have had to do what he did. But we can't use that as an excuse. And we're going to talk more about that. But I keep thinking about what he said in Matthew 17 and verse 20, when he told the disciples, he said, if you just had the faith of a grain of mustard seed, if you just had the faith of a mustard seed, how many of you know what a mustard seed looks like? Raise your hand. I mean, how big is a mustard seed? And you know that when you plant mustard or you plant turnips, any of those things, the seeds are so little, but they're also hard. And it takes them a long time to come up. So I just wonder if there's something about that too, the fact that mustard seed, even though it's small and it's very hard, if they could just have had that much faith. He says that they could move a mountain. And I know people think, well, he didn't mean that literally. Yes, he did, because he goes on and says that if you had just that little bit of faith, there is nothing that you could not do. Nothing. And again, he's talking to them. He's not talking to us. But how many of us have got some mountains in our lives? Not rocks and dirt, but mountains of doubt, mountains of desire. Some of us have got foothills. Some of us have got Mount Everest. And it's in and out. Some days are foothills, some days are Mount Everest. But God makes us a promise. He says that there's nothing, no temptation. And I think that means anything in life that happens to you, that God will give you a way to do what? To escape. He didn't say that all the mountains are going to go away. He just says you can escape. If we have enough what? Faith. And we're going to talk more about that, but continually he refers to them as those of little faith. And then we talked about it in John 15. Jesus no longer in verse 15, he no longer calls them servants, but he calls them friends. And he tells them that you are my friends because I told you all things that the Father has made known unto me. And he says in verse 16 that you did not choose me, I chose you. I chose you. Let me tell you something that we're going to discover, that we're going to find out in this study, is that God chose, Jesus chose, and they still choose special people. And remember what we said, what he says, John says in verse 16, he says, to whom much, in Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is what? Required. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Turn to Ephesians 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Does God still choose, does Jesus still choose special people? He does, and they do. And when those special people have a special relationship, not only with God, but with one another. Right? And God expects out of those special people extraordinary faith. Extraordinary faith. Listen, start with verse 1 in chapter 4 of Ephesians. Paul describing himself, he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord. What does that mean? What does it mean that you're a prisoner? Is that a bad thing? Does he mean this in a bad way? What does he mean by this? He refers to himself as a bond servant. What does that mean? What is a bond servant? Jerry, what's a bond servant? But he's bought and paid for, isn't he? And totally owned. So Paul says, listen, I belong to Jesus. And then he says this, beseech you. What does that mean? I beg you to walk worthy of the calling in which you were called, with all lowliness, gentleness, long-suffering, bearing with one another in love. It's not only our relationship with God and with Jesus, but it's our relationship with one another. And listen what he says in the next verse, in verse 3. What's it say? Endeavoring, doing everything you can to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Every time I see that word bond, and I can't help it, you know, what you do for a living has a big impact on how you think. Well, I worked with a telephone company for 35 and a half years, so there's a lot of lessons there. But when I think about bond, the telephone company had to keep, each one of their cables had a sheath, a metal sheath. And we had to bond that sheath to the power company verticals. Because if you didn't, your telephone at home, not your cell phone, that's a different world, but your telephone at home would be so noisy with 60 cycle noise. It's a hum. And if you've never heard it, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you have, you do. One of my neighbors years ago called me. I mean, this has been 40 years ago probably. No, it wasn't that long because I didn't work for 35. Anyway, 20 years ago. She called me and said, something's wrong with my phone. And she says, when I dial, it's making a noise. And that, those of you that know what dial means, that was, anyway. So anyway, I went over there, and the polarity was wrong on the phone. I turned it over, and it went away. And I told her, I said, Miss Culver, pick your phone up and dial and see if that sounds better. And she picked it up and said, oh, that's great. I listened, and the 60 cycle noise was so bad, I don't know how she ever heard anything. But she didn't know any better. What does bond mean? That bond means that it's got to be zero resistance. You understand that? A bond means that there's zero resistance. That you are 100% connected. And if you're not, you got noise. Do you get it, church? Do you get it, church? We are. Who distracts us? And who's the prince of this world? Listen what he says. Endeavoring, doing everything I can to keep the unity of the Spirit, God's Spirit, in the bond of peace.
And when two things are bonded, genuine, nothing can get between them.
You're right. See, it's unity. If you're bonded, you're unified. You're together. And you can take, if you take that bond off the phone company and the power company, and you put a ohm meter between it, you got zero current flow. Nothing. It's zeroed. Nothing. Zero. There's absolutely no resistance there. But if there is, you got noise. Listen what he says. What is unity? Listen. There is one body. What is the body? Ephesians, the first chapter, 22 and 23. What is the body? The church. The church. Listen, I'm not saying this. He's saying this. How many churches are there?
One.
How many churches are there?
One.
I can't start a church. You can't start a church. None of God's children can start a church.
When we went to Pennsylvania to work up there, I kept telling people we're not starting a new church. We're planting a congregation
Right.
that's already established.
You can't reinvent the wheel, people. Somebody's already done that. And you can't start the church. Somebody's already done that. What we've got to do is strive to be that church. We've got to strive to be that church. When there were about 3,000 people that obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost, what church were there? The one church. And I can't find anywhere in this book where they said that ever was another one started. And I'm not trying to say that we're right. I'm trying to say that this is right. I have no right to judge you or anybody else. God does that. And whether or not I'm the church depends on whether I follow the book. It's not hard. It's hard to follow it, but it's not hard to understand it. Listen, there's one church, one body, one spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Unity, unity, unity. One God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. The word one is used 7 times in 4 through 7. One. What does one mean? When Deborah and I got married, we became... What does that mean? If I'm married to her, that means I can't go off and be with somebody else, right? Because she and I are. And if I obey the gospel and the Lord adds me to the church, if I obey the gospel and the Lord adds me to the church, I can't go off and be with somebody else because I'm one with Christ, right? Shake your head this way. It's not difficult. We make it difficult. Listen. But listen to this. Listen. Does God expect us to be special? Does God expect us to be useful? Listen. But to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, he says, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. Now this he ascended, what does it mean? But that he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth. And you can read that in Acts 22 through 36. He actually went to the Hadean world. He who descended is also the one who ascended far above all heaven, that he might fill all things. He gave himself, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, teachers. Why did he do that? For the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the church, the body of Christ. So what's it about? What's all this about? The church. It's about us. You see, God's done what He was supposed to do, right? What'd God do? He gave His only Son. What did Jesus do? Gave His life for who? Say it, me. Me. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to give my life back. Right? Listen. What's verse 13 say? Boy, we read this stuff and we need to start being sponges rather than rocks. If you pour water on a rock, what's it do? If you pour water on a sponge, what's it do? Folks, we need to be sponges. Listen, till we all come to the unity of the faith. How many faiths? The faith. And of the knowledge of the Son of God to a, what's it say? What's it say? What's that mean? I'll never make a mistake. To a complete person. Listen, what am I measuring by? What's my measuring stick? I want to be as good as Dave. Is that what my measuring stick is? To the measure of the fullness of Christ. That's my goal. Church, that's our goal. And I'm afraid that we're shooting too low. Like the old boy said one time, he said he got mad at old boy and he told him, he says, I'm finna do away with you. He said, well, you shaking, you couldn't hit me. He said, all I got to do is hit you between the head and the ground. We're shooting too low. Listen, till we become this complete person. Listen to verse 14. Why is this so important? Look at the world around you and listen to verse 14. That we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. But speaking the truth in love may, what's the next two words? The original King James says what? Grow up. I love that. You know what's wrong with our society? People don't grow up anymore. We got 40 and 50 and 60-year-old children. Don't even know they got to work for a living. Think that somebody else is supposed to take care of them. They never grew up. And we got the same thing in the church. We got a bunch of 40 and 50-year-old children who think somebody else is supposed to take care of them. But it's not about me. What's it about, Brent? It's about you. Right? Paul says, don't just think on your things or what concerns you, but think on the concerns of others. Then I'm supposed to put you ahead of me.
When it talks about the doctrine of men, I think the main reason we have so many denominations is because of people trying to twist the Bible to fit what they want their life to be instead of twisting their life to fit.
You know it is. Yeah, what she said is people are trying to twist the Bible to match their life rather than to twist their life to match the Bible. And that's what it is. It's not convenient. Being a Christian is not convenient. It's not popular. Listen. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things unto Him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. So if we all work together, I don't think there's anything we can't do. How many does it take to mess it up? Bond. In John 15 and verse 5, well, look at 1 Corinthians first chapter. I want you to listen to this. We just talked about unity. Listen to this. Verse 10. Paul again's begging. Listen. I plead with you, brethren. I plead with you not by me, but by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together, same mind, same judgment. That's the goal. But what happens when that doesn't happen? He goes on and said that there were contentions among them. They were divided. And he makes a statement. He says, is Christ divided? Is Christ divided? How can you call yourself the body of Jesus and be divided? Listen. In John 15 and verse 5, we read that. What's it say? Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. And he says this, he that abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. And then he says, for without me, you can do nothing. You can do nothing. So, church, what are we doing? Who are we attached to? Or are there divisions, or are there contentions? Or are we bonded? Are we all saying the same thing? Turn to John chapter 5 and verse 30. John 5 and verse 30. I think Kent talked about this, how that you can read verses over and over and over and over, and then one day you read a verse and it just... Well, this is one of those verses. And it just hit me when I read it. And Jesus says, I can of myself do nothing. What? You're talking about the Son of God. You're talking about somebody that's equal with God. You're talking about one of the Godhead three. And he says, I can of myself do nothing. And then he says, what? As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. So let's see, what does that, if we put that in Alabama, what does that mean? What does that mean in Alabama? Jesus says, I do what I'm told. You get that? Jesus said, I don't do anything unless I'm told first. So let's see. This from the most special person that was ever chosen, the only begotten Son of God, who gave it all for me. And he said, I don't do anything unless the Father tells me to. What about us? We don't like to be told, do we? Sometimes Deborah just gets on my, she starts telling me what to do.
And if God's will is different than ours, we try to justify doing it our way.
What's he say? He says, I listen. And when I hear what the Father says, I decide that that's what I need to do. And he said, when I do that, what the Father says, I can say that's righteous. And I and you are the same way. When we do what the Father says, we can look at ourselves and say, I'm righteous. But when I don't, the stinking thinking's got me. And I start thinking that I know more than God. I start thinking that what Satan tells me, like Eve, that this is a better idea. And when I do, it not only affects my life, but it affects your life. Because we're supposed to be like that. And when Brent goes out to try to teach somebody, and they saw me doing something that I was not supposed to do because I'm supposed to be like that, it hurts Brent and what he's trying to do. Right? That's why it's so important that we be bonded. Perfectly joined together. Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. She says every time somebody says, I know the Bible says this, but here we go. Down the rocky road. Bumpy, bumpy, bumpy. So, what about us? Turn to 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. I'm going to try to read this in this little bitty book. Listen. Here we are. I've obeyed the gospel. Okay? What does that mean? What does it mean when I say I've obeyed the gospel? What have I done? What's the Bible say? Jesus says, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. You don't have to have a college degree to understand that, do you? And is a conjunction. You can't have the first part unless you do the second part. Deborah said I shouldn't talk about slap out tick, but we even learned that at slap out tick. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Okay? Listen, okay? Therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking, as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that I may do what? Grow. Listen, people, that's the beginning. That's not the end. Once you come up out of that water, that burial, Romans 6 calls it a burial. And we're probably going to talk more about that. But I'm supposed to, my old man of sin is what? Destroyed. And I'm supposed to rise a what? New creation. That the old things are passed away. That all things are new. I'm new. But as that new creature, listen. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious, coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious, you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Romans 12, what does Paul say in Romans 12, verse 1? I beg you, brethren, that you present your bodies a living what? Sacrifice. What does that word mean? You know, our society has messed up words. Words don't mean what they used to. What does the word sacrifice mean? Give it all, right? Give it all. Jesus Christ was a sacrifice for my sin and your sin. What does that mean? He gave it all. So I'm supposed to become this living stone, this living spiritual sacrifice. He's not talking to somebody else. Who's he talking to? Me. Me, listen. Verse 6, therefore it is also contained in the Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. Therefore to you who believe, he is precious, but to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. We sing a song, and it goes like this. What a friend I have in Jesus. Are we a friend? What a friend I have in Jesus. Am I his friend? He called the disciples and says, listen, I'm not going to call you servants anymore. I'm going to call you friends. Are we a friend of Jesus? Verse 9. Listen what he says in verse 9. Church, you are a chosen generation. Does God and Jesus still choose special people? Shake your head this way. You, church, are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. The disciples were special people, weren't they? And they were given all kind of things nobody else is given. And God expected much out of them because much was given. Let me tell you something, church. The church is a special people, a chosen people by God. And we have been given much, and God expects much in return. When the world looks at us, they ought to see something different. We say we're different. We say we go by this. And I told you, how many have I got pointing at me? I got 3 pointing at me and 1 at you. When Jesus talked about those around him in his day on this earth, he said, you can tell the disciples from the ones that are not, because you shall know them by their fruits. I've told you this before. I can call myself a rocket scientist. I could even put me on a little shirt and put me a name up there, Michael, rocket scientist. You don't want to ride no rocket I made. I can call myself a Christian. I can put my little shirt on. Michael Brock, Christian. If I'm a Christian, I shouldn't have to tell anybody. They ought to know it, right? I ought to be different. I ought to be different. And the sad thing is, and listen, you know I'm right. If we're not guilty, and if we're not careful, we're guilty of trying to be like everybody else around us. You know, there's a shortage of just about everything, because of this COVID stuff, right? But you know what I've noticed there's a short of? Breeches legs. They're shipping women's shorts without legs anymore. There's a shortage of legs. Church, we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to be different. Listen, you are a holy nation. His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who hath not obtained mercy, who have had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Here's the question. How much are we willing to be special? And what are we willing to give? Jesus gave it all. Are we going to be guilty like the 1-talent servant? Remember the 1-talent servant? And when Jesus comes, and he's coming, if he doesn't come, we're going. Are we going to be like that servant and have excuses? Do you remember when you did something as a kid and you were standing before you? Mine was my daddy. I think he got a thrill out of beating me. And can you remember making excuses? I mean, some of them so stupid. I mean, you know, he'd have had to been an idiot to believe what I told him. Can you imagine standing before the Creator and making excuses? And Matthew 7 says it's going to be that way, right? Matthew 25 says it's going to be that way. But Lord, I did this and that. You didn't do what I told you to. What Jesus say? As I hear, I do. What about us, church? What about us? So listen to this. And I've done this before, but I want to do it again. Listen to this. For God so loved the world. That's the people, not the place. You got me? For God so loved the world. Not the sphere, not the circle, but the race. For God so loved the world. That's the soul, not the soil. For God so loved people. People. You and I. That He gave His only begotten Son. What are we willing to give? The lesson is ours. Thank you for your attention.